Clock, so we'll wait a few minutes for anybody who's got issues to signing in, and then we'll start to listen to me talk. All right. Thank everyone who's signed in and to participate in this book launch. It's always a great experience to finally be done with a project that's taken up a few years. Uh, for those of y'all who don't know me, I'm a born and raised New Orleanian, and sort of came to this project and history in general, partly because of my family's background. Uh, we're sort of recent arrivals to New Orleans. We're not an old line New Orleans family. My uncle actually moved here in the 1950s to work in the research lab in City Park, the federal research facility. He grew up in Kentucky, and then my grandparents moved to New Orleans in like the 60s because they wanted to get away from the snow. And then my dad, who was a career Air Force officer, ended up settling here because my grandparents were here and my uncle was here. And he married my mom, who's German. And she loved New Orleans because it's such a European city. And so that's how I was sort of surrounded by these sort of multicultural uh, backgrounds. My grandfather was from Lithuania, thus the last name Stanonis. And so I've always had this sort of touristy view of New Orleans as a family that came to the city within the last century. But also growing up here, you're sort of surrounded by history. And so I always wanted to do history. Uh, Went to Loyola University, New Orleans to major in history. Ended up at Vanderbilt as a Don Doyle student, where I did my master's and my PhD. Then hopped around different portions of the South. Uh, Taught for a while at Texas A&M, University of South Carolina, then overseas in Ireland at the Queen's University in Belfast, and then finally said I've had enough, and then I was going to come home to New Orleans and read and do research on the things I was interested in, which in this case was pralines. And so, you know, my research has generally been on New Orleans and the American South. My first book was Creating the Big Easy. It looked at uh, tourism development in New Orleans in the 20s and 30s, particularly the role of the automobile. Uh, The one thing I didn't cover was foodways. So then I did an edited collection called Dixie Emporium, looking at foodways in the South. And then there was the issue of sort of New Orleans in its broader context. So I did a book on the development of beach resorts in the South after the Civil War, called Faith in Bikinis. Um, and then the book I'm talking about today, New Orleans Pralines. And, you know, one of the things that brought me to this project was obviously uh, growing up. I had a lot of German relatives who were visiting, so I've done all the little tourist things that are popular in New Orleans. Uh, so spent a lot of time wandering around, say, Aunt Sally's in the French market. My mother would love to cook New Orleans recipes when people came to visit, and so one of those was pralines a lot when I was growing up. So I saw her struggle with how to make those things because it's such a skill to figure out when the sugar is ready to boil and harden, which is also probably why I became a little overweight when I was a kid. Uh, and one of the things I came across when I was doing this research was that Richard Simmons, the exercise guru, sweating to the oldies in the 80s and 1990s, uh, he grew up in the French Quarter. And in his early interviews, he actually blames pralines for his becoming overweight because he was surrounded by pralines within the French Quarter tourism industry. His first job was at Lee's Pralines. And so he was talking about how he was just sitting around eating pralines all the time. And it struck me because one of the arguments I have early on in the book, when I'm tracing sort of the origins of pralines and how they ended up in New Orleans, is that our perception of the praline as this sort of tourist souvenir, this heirloom recipe that goes back to France, all of that is really a myth. Uh, the way we should think about the praline is that it's the 19th century version of an energy bar. The sugar of a praline, went out and got one. I'm not eating it because I'd be jumping up on the ceiling. Uh, that this high calories of cheap sugar uh, was really there to power bodies, working class bodies in industry. There's a lot of work that's been done on sugar consumption in the United States and in Europe. That cheap sugar in the 1800s was a way of empowering the working class. So, for instance, by 1880, the leading country in terms of sugar production was actually Germany, because Otto von Bismarck saw sugar as a way of in helping with industrialization. In the 1890s, Germany actually, the government brings in W.E.B. Du Bois to study in Berlin because they want to hear his experiences observing sharecropping in the South, partly because the Germans want to develop cotton plantations in Africa, but also how to figure out uh, more beet sugar production in Polish areas of Eastern Prussia. So sugar is very much a part of, in this case, the sugar plantations of Louisiana. And everything points to the praline being born on sugar plantations in Louisiana, not influenced, as the myths are, coming from France and the Duc de Praline and his chef back in the 1600s, and how French colonists brought this recipe to Louisiana. Praline, in the French term, being sugar-coated nut. Uh, no, that the evidence isn't there for that. There's actually several articles with people who were in their 90s and hundreds that newspapers interviewed back in the 1940s and 50s, for instance, and they said that they had never heard of these things until the 1880s, 1890s. Right? So part of this book early on was tracing out how did this come to be. And like I say, everything points to sugar plantations because we know African American women were the cooks on plantations. We know African Americans who were enslaved were excellent foragers, and pecans historically were an ideal forage crop. Native Americans had very much incorporated pecans into their diet and traded it widely. There's evidence of pecans all the way into northern Canada because the hard shell allowed it to travel well for trade. And we know African Americans were excellent at knowing how to boil down sugar because that was what they were forced to do. And we know from the research I've done, that the praline is sort of indigenous to Louisiana uh, because French speakers in Louisiana actually gave it their own word. Right? They don't call it a praline. And it's one of the interesting things I discovered because I think I did my very first presentation on this back in 2015 at the Southern Historical Association meeting. I was just throwing out ideas to get feedback. And back then, I would say praline because my family were outsiders. And these two New Orleanians came up and corrected me and said, well, the French in Louisiana and New Orleans would say praline. And so I've switched it over time to get past that hurdle because praline as a word is sort of a gatekeeper word in New Orleans, right? It's the same as sort of whether you say streetcar as a local or, if someone says trolley, they're not from here. If they're from New Orleans, they'll say neutral ground instead of median. Uh, and what was fascinating is when I was doing my research is that in Louisiana, French speakers actually use the term plarine, Plarine. A plarine, coming from the French word for flat, it's where in English we get the word plate from, and that was the word that was used among French-speaking Louisianans uh, up until around the First World War. And it disappears partly because of that generation, the older generation of French speakers, dying out. Also, I think very much because of the increasing rise of tourism as a part of the New Orleans economy. Uh, because you didn't have to explain what a praline was. Everybody, sugar-coated nut. You go into fancy stores today, and there's pralines this and pralines that, chocolate-coated, cream-filled. So it was sort of a generic word that people understood, where a plarine was not generally understood. So praline sort of becomes the key term. Uh, and that's sort of the unexpected, sort of fun quirks of doing this as a project, and seeing how this research I've done and spent now probably about 25 years exploring different aspects of the South and foodways and New Orleans in particular, how they come together in unique ways. And one of those ways is, for instance, the story of Aunt Sally's pralines, uh, which, as I say, I spent a lot of time watching that store in the French market, going there, getting free samples, watching the show window where there were into the early 90s, I think, there were African Americans who would be sort of in their show window making pralines at Aunt Sally's. So I've always been sort of curious about the history of Aunt Sally's, and especially having worked on the 20s and 30s, how prominent Aunt Sally's becomes in the 1930s. Today, it's probably the best known praline shop in New Orleans. And so part of this research was sort of tracing out the history of different shops and when I could, different sellers, early on African American sellers in the 1800s, early 20th century, by the 1920s and 30s, tracing out the origins of the tourist shops that sort of take over the trade after the First World War, and African Americans are sort of pushed away from the streets. Uh, Aunt Sally's sort of combined all my research because it's founded by a guy named Pierre Bagour, and his grandfather owned a clothing shop on Decatur back around the 1860s, 1870s. His dad takes over that business, And when Bagor comes of age, he goes into a different direction. He gets married in 1909. By 1910, he's listed as a car salesman, uh, which is, in 1910, he's most likely dealing in high-end cars, given before the Model T emerges as a mass-produced car. Um, and he's fairly successful at it. And I say that he's still a car dealer in the 1920s. Uh, I know he's successful at it because when the Great Depression hits, a lot of his real estate investments end up foreclosed on by the banks. So he's invested heavily in, say, lots in Uptown, and he's invested heavily in lots in the emerging neighborhood of Lakeview. So here was a guy who was very much about the emergence of car culture. Here was a guy who, was investing in the development of the lakefront in the 1920s, which really is being developed to sort of mimic the Florida real estate boom in the 1920s. New Orleans wanted a piece of that pie, so thus putting in the seawall and developing the lakefront. Uh, and so by the 1930s, he's losing his fortune and he disappears from the record and reemerges in 1935 with Aunt Sally's. And what's interesting there, I tracked it down. This, by the way, is his very first box that he uses to pack pralines in. Uh, a lot of praline tourist shops in the 1920s and well, really up until the late 1960s, early 1970s, would pack pralines in fake little cotton bales, oftentimes with African American sort of mammified imagery on it. And partly it it's a double souvenir, right? The praline is a souvenir of New Orleans. The box itself is a souvenir, but when I finally tracked one down from the 1930s version, I actually realized that there's a cushioning effect to putting them in sort of fake cotton bales, given how fragile pralines are. Uh, so he becomes this major figure in the promotion of tourism in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. What was particularly striking about him is that in December of 1940, he also becomes the first person in New Orleans to push the city government to license him as the first person to operate carriage rides in the French Quarter, horse-drawn carriages. He hires African American men to operate them and take tourists from the various locations of his shops. He's got about four or five by the time 1940 rolls around. So, a remarkable story of a guy who sort of pushes out the horse, then embracing through the automobile, then embracing the praline, and bringing back the horse, celebrating the horse as a nostalgic way to re-experience the French Quarter. And there was a whole bunch of quirky things that popped up in doing this research, because originally, I actually planned this to be an article. Uh, and then immediately I discovered that there was so much out there about the praline that we didn't know about, and I certainly didn't know about, that countered all the mythology. So when I was going to do my article, the first thing I did was look at travel narratives for New Orleans before the Civil War. And when people came to New Orleans, they always went to the French market. If you look at travel narratives from the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, they'd go to the French market. There would be two, three, 4 pages just listing all the different ethnicities and languages and huge lists of all the different food items because they were odd, right? Because at the French market, the produce of North America, South America, Europe are all coming together along the levee. And I couldn't find any references to pralines or plarines in those. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird because they list everything that we sort of associate with New Orleans today. And then I went to the first two cookbooks, uh, which were published in 1885 for the Cotton Expo, the first being Lafcadio Hearn's La Cuisine Creole. Uh, and those two cookbooks in 1885 didn't have a recipe for pralines. And I said, well, this is really weird. This is never going to be an article. This has a detective story aspect to it. Uh, and so that's, how I decided this was going to become a book and tracing out what the praline tells us about New Orleans and why did these myths emerge that this food item came from France when all the evidence pointed to the enslaved African Americans on sugar plantations. Uh, and why did this only enter the popular culture of New Orleans uh, in the 1880s and then really explode in the 1890s? So that was sort of my detective work, uh, really noticing that a lot of this centers around the Cotton Expo of 84, 85. And it looks from the evidence that the praline developed on sugar plantations really comes to New Orleans with emancipation as African Americans seek the opportunities of the city, getting out of the rural parts of Louisiana, escaping the plantation life to seek opportunity in New Orleans. Um, and that the Cotton Expo of 85 sort of takes the praline out of the African American community. There's been a long tradition of street sellers going back into the antebellum period of African American free, but also enslaved, selling products on the streets. So it's easy to see how the praline would then enter into that market. And then with the Cotton Expo in 1885, tourists from the north coming to the city, really going to the French Quarter, because a lot of them have read one of the best-selling novels of the 1880s, which is George Washington Cable's The Grandissimes, and that they're wandering around the, the French Quarter, and obviously African American vendors were looking to sell something local, and so this was a ready market, which is why all of a sudden you start to see by 1885 and after this increased discussion of the praline and its role within the city. Which opens up a lot of questions like what does the praline mean? And a lot of what I cover once I get past the first couple chapters is looking at what the praline means within New Orleans and eventually the South and the nation. Uh, and what I argue is in many ways the praline is a symbol of the the South at the time of the Civil War, right? Uh, that it captures a bunch of different meanings. On one hand, uh, it's brown sugar. And I encountered that within Louisiana and New Orleans, there's a nostalgia, as the title of my book says, about brown sugar, right? Especially meaning white New Orleanians who are embracing the lost cause myth of Louisiana and the Confederacy, that brown sugar was associated with plantations. Uh, Back in the day when sugar was processed and boiled down on plantations by the enslaved and then shipped to market, and that this nostalgia in the 1880s, 1890s, this looking back to the lost cause and the romanticized Old South uh, is competing against the rise of the the sugar trust, producing white sugar and flooding the market. So it's sort of this Southern pride versus this, Yankee invasion of cheap sugar in the late 1800s, which was oftentimes heavily refined white sugar. And so there's a battle going on in that regard. And when you see ads in the early 20th century for pralines, they very much emphasize that it's Louisiana sugar or plantation sugar, and that theme gets hammered a lot. At the same time, what's fascinating about the praline, what makes it so popular within New Orleans culture, is the pecan. Right? Because the pecan has its own history, and in this regard, it's the exact opposite. That the pecan is a symbol of the New South. Coming out of the Civil War, there were advocates for diversification of agriculture in the South to get away from the staple crops of sugar, but also mainly cotton, to develop industry, to develop different agricultural products. And the pecan becomes a symbol of that agricultural diversification, really one of the more successful symbols of that diversification. And so the praline combined these sort of dreams, right, among white New Orleanians and Louisianans and Southerners, this Old South and this New South sort of joined together. So that's one thing that I'm unpacking in the book, how these myths and these images trace out. On the other hand, I'm also looking at the street sellers themselves, which is one of the real fun things in terms of doing this research. Because on one hand, you have the African American street seller, generally women. Uh, and for the African American community, the praline seller is a symbol of ingenuity and entrepreneurship and drive. And at the same time, you have Jim Crow era whites in New Orleans who increasingly convert that entrepreneurship of the street seller and retell her story in sort of a mammified way in which the street seller becomes a symbol of Black loyalty to the former white enslavers. So there's numerous stories. It sort of becomes a, a genre of literature in Louisiana of these vendors being retold as not earning money for themselves, but going out onto the streets selling pralines and taking that money to support the white family that's on hard times after the Civil War. Uh, and so, one of the things I really tried to do, particularly in the first chapter, was to trace out when I could the histories of the African American uh, street sellers where you actually got a name and could sort of go through and trace out, which is kind of tricky, but there's a handful of them that I could do this with, partly through census records, partly through court records. Uh, One of the things that I discovered is that the very first postcard of New Orleans, that's actually what it is. I'll hold it up rather than do a slide. This is a sketch done by Selena Brez at Newcomb College in 1895. So what's now Tulane University. And Selena Brez is what she's known for locally, is she's in the first pottery class. She sells the first piece of Newcomb pottery. But in my research, I found an article around the time of the First World War where she says that she made the first postcard of New Orleans. And I was like, well, that's wild. I've never heard of this. And so I started tracking it down. The local archives had a few from the First World War issue, but I was trying to see if I could find an original. And so I tracked one down to a dealer in Florida. The one I found, so what happens is she does this art exhibit at Newcomb in 1895. She then turns that sketch into a postcard. And the postcard I tracked down is actually mailed on Mardi Gras Day of 1899. And it's sent by a family to Switzerland. So very early on in the 1890s, we know that the image of New Orleans in this first postcard is associated with the praline seller. which tells us something about how important it comes to New Orleans identity, both the praline and the African American seller. That's telling us something about the culture in the city at the time. But we also know that it's an international image because here it is. It's going to Switzerland, and when they got there, they didn't throw it away. They preserved it, right? So that someday ends up in a shop in Florida of somehow. So it's comes back to the States. Um, and so, I just say I donated that to the archives at Loyola, if anybody ever wants to go and see the original postcard. Uh, my understanding is that that sketch is of Marie Louise, who was famous for working uh, the steps at Newcomb College in the 1890s, really into the First World War. By the time the First World War happens, her daughter takes over that location. Marie Louise is fascinating. I could never track down her full name. She's only ever referred to as Marie Louise in Newcomb publications and the newspapers and the like. Uh, but what's fascinating about her is that she was a very shrewd businesswoman. She gives us an insight into how praline sellers worked. Uh, because she worked Newcomb, she had access to wealthy families in New Orleans. So she sort of plays the mammy role to make money and to become successful in her business. She starts doing parties, she starts doing conventions. Uh, when the alumni at Newcomb start a so-called Creole kitchen to serve lunch, to the women going to the college, uh, Marie Louise doubles the size of her pralines and cuts the price, and within a year drives the lunchroom out of business. And they have meetings where they talk about they can't compete with this shrewd businesswoman who's working the steps. And there are several stories like that show um, the entrepreneurial spirit of these African American women uh, working these streets in New Orleans. Uh, and so I look at that as much as I could. Like I say, a lot of it's difficult to reconstruct those lives, but there's something about praline sellers that gives us a window into sort of working class Black life in New Orleans because they become so prominent within the city's culture and the tourism industry. Newspapers will actually report on them with their full name. So, for instance, in 1908, there's a praline seller that dies named Elizabeth Carter, and the newspapers report on her death. And then I could find the court records because she dies with no heirs, and you could get like her whole family's history because all the family petitioned to the court to divide up her savings, which is actually a large amount. $620 in 1908 was a lot of savings for a working class African American woman. Uh, and in the 1920s, there's a seller that dies named Tante Clementine. Uh, and through references, she disappears. So they're all looking for her. It actually makes the front page of like the New Orleans newspapers to find her whereabouts. And so through her address and through different references within the article, I could track down sort of her history, which was a fun part of this book to rediscover those lives. Um, so yeah, I look at this. I look at the history of the pecan. I look at the history of sugar. I look at the mythology that's built around the praline and why that happens. Why this becomes sort of a literary trope. Uh, Oftentimes specifically because of George Washington Cable's novel, The Grandissimes, because Cable was a born and raised New Orleanian. And in his novel, he gets run out of town for the novel because he um, advocates for integration. His novel is very much about interracial relationships in New Orleans and how closely uh, that basically the color line doesn't exist, that blacks and whites are living together and working together. He comes out of the Civil War, even though he was a Confederate during the war. He's totally disillusioned by his experiences during seeing combat and seeing what the war did to the South. So he comes out as very much one of the strongest advocates for African American rights after the war. And in his novel, there's a character named Clements, who's a street seller in the antebellum period. Uh, in this fictionalized version, who confronts whites when they start talking about how great slavery is as an institution. She confronts them and tells them how wrong they are, which then leads a mob to take her to the swamp and shoot her in the back. And partly the mythology within the literature that emerges, led by Grace King and mainly white women writers afterwards, was to sort of counter George Washington's Cable's account of uh, Clements and what happens to her in New Orleans. So I look at all that, and it takes you in some quirky ways. And one last story I'll tell it from my research. I was curious, and I conclude the book by looking at Evans Candy Shop, which was the last shop in New Orleans. Uh, it was in the French market, last shop in New Orleans that still had mammy imagery. It had a big sign with this smiling African American woman's face with the tig on and such. And that was up until 2015 when Cafe Du Monde bought out Evans. So the last thing I discovered when I was doing this book, I was fact checking what year that happened. It was in 2015. And a name popped up in reference to the head of Cafe Du Monde. The last name was Roman, and it triggered a memory. I was like, well, that can't be because it was like Jack Roman or something, J. Roman. I said, well, that's impossible, right? The quirks of history. Uh, and then I fact checked it, and it turned out that the Cafe Du Monde is run by the Roman family now, and the Roman family, in this unique way, sort of bookends the story of the praline in my account because uh, when they buy and they remove this mammified image, uh, the history of the Roman family actually takes us back to the very origins of the pecan. Uh, so there's, and the origins of the pecan as a sort of industrialized product goes back to Oak Alley Plantation in the 1840s. Oak Alley was owned by Jacques Telesphore Roman, who enslaved an African man named Zephyr, who was the lead sugar processor on Oak Alley. And because of his expertise, which he learns as a survival skill, his child, Antoine, didn't have to go work in the fields. Antoine becomes the gardener. And Antoine figures out how to graft pecan trees because planters were trying to grow pecans from seed. And that means that you never get a consistent pecan tree. So Antoine figures out grafting. Um, and after the Civil War, the new owner of the plantation uh, takes the pecan to the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. It wins all kind of awards, and it really births the nursery industry and the idea of planting pecan orchards. So to see the Roman family sort of lead this birth of the pecan and then the removal of that mammy imagery was a really strange sort of twist at the end as I was fact checking this book. Like I say, it's you know been a fun project that gives you some insights into the stories that I tell without giving away too much of the detail, which I hope you'll read. As I understand, LSU Press will post a link to buy the book with a 40% discount. So I hope you buy it. I hope you read it, and I hope you like it. I'd always love to hear feedback. Uh, in that sense, just to wrap up, in terms of any future projects I'm working on, I'm interested in sort of doing a big project on voodoo, sort of voodoo in American culture. There's actually a strange twist in that research because in one of the very first accounts of praline sellers in New Orleans, in a short story from 1885 published in the Picayune, there's these two white women who encounter Marie Laveau, and they're horrified and scared from the evil vibes they get from Marie Laveau, and they start running through the French Quarter. They run to Rampart Street, where they encounter a praline seller who protects them in this very mammified way. And so, there's interesting links, like I say, with all these research. So that's sort of my big project in the future that I keep plugging away at. Hopefully, I'll get around to actually writing it sooner now that this project's out of the way. But obviously, there's a lot to cover. So thank you all for listening. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to see if I can answer them. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you speak more about the experience of sort of writing the book in New Orleans and in the space and how that sort of influenced your writing and sense of place while doing your research and writing?
Yeah, one of the things I live in the Carrollton neighborhood, so I do a lot of walking. I do a lot of walking in Audubon Park, actually. And one of the things that struck me was just how layered uh, this history is, because, you know, Audubon Park is the site of Etienne Boré's plantation. And Etienne Boré in 1795 becomes famous in Louisiana because he's the first guy to, he hires a sugar expert from, uh, I think it was from what becomes Haiti, to come and work on his plantation. He figures out how to crystallize sugar, right, to process sugar. And so this, really is the turning point that creates the sugar industry in Louisiana. So it was really hard, walking around this area of New Orleans and walking through Audubon Park because you can't help but think of it in that sense of this. The history here is of a sugar plantation. And I was actually walking through. I put this in the acknowledgments or the intro of the book. I was walking around one day and just happened to encounter an African American woman who was talking with a friend of hers about how growing up back in the 60s and 70s, her dad would take her to Edgar, Louisiana, to cut cane so that she could have that connection and her siblings could have that connection to what the ancestors had to experience on sugar plantations. Uh, so, growing up here and writing this book, immersed in the tourism industry of the praline and how its function within the tourism industry, but also being aware of, how recent the sugar industry was so prominent in Louisiana as a lived experience. Uh, it makes you much more sensitive to the stories that you tell. Especially say when you're dealing with like an Elizabeth Carter in 1908 and all you have are like a handful of documents. How do you interpret her life and the experiences of her family? Um, it's pretty awing in some ways.
Thank you. You talked about like an overarching great project that you're hoping to work on in the future. Are there other projects that you're considering working on next that you'd like to chat about or shout out?
Um, I became, well, because I was working on this project, I've looked a good bit at city ordinances on like the public markets and the regulation of street vending and one of the things I've became fascinated by, totally by accident, as like this, how projects evolve. One of the shorter projects I'm curious about is the history of fire departments in the South, but particularly New Orleans, because I came across this guy, Thomas O'Connor, who's the first fire chief in New Orleans. and he's the fire chief from 1869 until 1911. Uh, his house and his fire station are still on Julia. You can wander down there and see it. When he dies, he commits suicide in 1911 because he's in his early 70s and he couldn't go to fires anymore. When he dies, he's actually on the front page of the New York Times as one of the leading fire experts in the United States. Um, and as much as we have research about policing in the South, we don't have a lot on fire departments in the South or in the United States in general. And the South does something unique. The New Orleans Fire Department isn't a professional city-run fire department until 1891, whereas most northern cities go professional city-run departments before the Civil War. And partly it is the Civil War that causes southern cities to avoid going professionalized because then you're subject to civil rights legislation. So I'm sort of curious about that and the development of the South and the role of fire departments in the South. So totally different direction, which may be why I'm sort of curious to go there. Because the Voodoo Project is a much bigger project, and have to set aside a few months to in different archives to really dig deep. But I'll get them both done eventually.
Thank you. Have you had the chance to share this book with folks yet? And if so, what sort of reactions have you gotten from people that you've shared the book with?
Yeah, this just came out. So I've had one talk prior to this. And generally reaction's positive. The one thing is that encountering that the myths are really strong, and really dearly held. Uh, w- there's several stories. So on one hand, there's the story and the image of the praline seller. On the other hand, there's the story and myths about the praline itself. So they're two distinct sort of storylines. And one of the things with the story of the praline is when you start to say that it doesn't come from France, that it's indigenous to sugar plantations, and there's a distinct word for it, is that you start to challenge some deeply held, dearly held stories about the praline. So one of those that is the story that the Ursuline nuns brought the praline to Louisiana because they come from the region that the Duke was from, and then they taught it to the women who went to the school that the Ursuline nuns operated in the 1700s. Um, Honestly, that story, I don't encounter that until the cookbook comes out in 1971. Is it Re Memories and Repasts? It's for reminiscences and repasts that first promotes that story. Um, it's really not. There's no evidence that that's true, as I lay out sort of in the conclusion of the book. But there's these really dearly held myths about the praline because they're so important to the identity of the city. So that's been really interesting to encounter.
Thank you so much. Well, you covered everything so well that I think we are done with questions, and I think we can go ahead and say thanks and goodbye to the audience.
Okay, well, thank you all for tuning in and for listening to me, and hope you enjoy the book. Thank you.